Hello. In this episode of Airs for Architecture, I spoke with Dinah Bornat, architect, urban designer and founder-director of ZCD Architects. We discuss her new book, All to Play For, How to Design Child-Friendly Housing, published by the RIBA this year. Our discussion goes all over the place, but ultimately, we focus on the central question. How can we create cities where children can truly thrive? Well, by making family-friendly architecture, of course. What other option is there?
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture, and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Airs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Dinah Bornat, architect and now writer and educator previously. And we're going to be talking about Dinah's terrific, very beautiful new book, All to Play For, How to Design Child-Friendly Housing, which, Dinah, you published with RIBA Publishing this year. When did it come out? A month ago?
It came out in February, this year.
Not even a month. So, Dinah, before we get into the book, as per usual, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself, please?
Thanks for having me, Ambrose. So my name's Dinah Bornat, and I'm an architect. I've got a practice called ZCD Architects, and we're based in East London. We've been here for a while. ZCD's been going for 11 years now, and but I've been practicing as an architect for nearly 30.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Something like that, yeah.
Where did you train?
So I did my degree at University of Liverpool, and I did my what was called diploma then, which I think we now call a master's, at the University of East London, which was really interesting because my tutor in fourth and fifth year was Ron Heron of Archigram, and that was fascinating insight at the time into the work of Archigram, which back then was, still quite recent-ish. Yeah. But sadly, he passed away during that course, so that was a bit of a rupture for the school and everybody, really. That was a sad time.
Yeah.
And then I actually also later on, about 15, nearly 20 years ago, actually, I did a master's at UCL in planning and regeneration, which is probably, if I was to talk through my career, was a bit of a deliberate turning point for me.
Can you explain that? Why did you need a turning point?
Well, I had worked for Edward Cullinan Architects for a long time. In fact, I have a kind of unusual career path in some ways because I didn't quite get the A levels that I wanted to get into the University of Sheffield, where I was applying back when I was a school leaver, and fell on my feet and got a job as a office assistant at Ted Cullinan's office, who I had no idea who they were. But I walked through the door and I thought, this is where I want to be.
Yeah.
Had this incredible year enjoying what architecture was all about and how, as Ted put it, it's a social act. And I think ever since then, I've been practicing that theory. So I worked there, and with some brief forays abroad, I went to Singapore for my year out and did various other bits, and then came back and worked there and worked on some big projects like the maths faculty in Cambridge, and had two children. And I think I was looking for a change in direction, to do sort of something that was a bit more me, maybe. I'd been there for quite a long time. It felt a bit like this was my family and I loved them dearly, and I kind of needed to leave home. I got a commission to design a house on the South Downs Way, and it was really interesting to be able to do that and to challenge it didn't get planning permission, which was interesting, and I appealed and won. And the house was built from rammed chalk and timber and reclaimed clay tiles, and it was a kind of labour of love with a really interesting contractor who had built the Straw Bale House for Sarah Wigglesworth and Jeremy Till. And so we did this incredible project together. And I thought, that's interesting that you can kind of unpick the planning process yourself. And I was interested in, I think at the time, that course at UCL was inspired by the Urban White Paper. So it was a few years later, and actually probably around the same time, there were lots of other people with the same thought. How do we put this urban renaissance into practice? How do we as architects have an impact on the bigger, wider world? I was kind of interested in big strategic things, I think. And that course was really interesting. And I studied under Peter Hall, another kind of
Titanic figure.
yeah, absolutely. And he'd been involved in some big he'd been a government advisor and been involved in some big infrastructure projects, and written a number of really important books about cities. And just thinking about cities, it's the joy of being an architect, I think, is that you can be talking 1 minute about countersinking a screw, and another minute, or in a parallel career, about cities and migration and, all sorts of big things. So
Yeah.
I love that about architecture.
Yeah. I like the story of Ted Cullinan. I remember going into his office. Perhaps you even worked there at the time. Perhaps we've physically been actually in the same room and seeing that big, if I'm not wrong, they had a big blue table that they had Friday meals at.
Yeah, that's right.
And I thought, I want to work here. I didn't get the job, so I didn't work here.
We were in a big club. There was quite a lot of people. That table had come from, I'm assuming that you're too young to have seen the Camden office, but that table had come from the Camden Jamestown Road office and been supplanted in the Islington office.
I see.
And there was an awful lot of that, kind of reusing things that
Yeah.
you had.
That's a really fascinating story, and I really like this idea as well of the architect thinking about the countersunk screw and the city at the same time. I remember, I think it was Sally Stone at Manchester gave out a paper. I was in her unit in undergraduate. I think it was her anyway, gave out a paper called something like "The City is Like the Spoon" or something like that. And it was a similar idea. All I remember vaguely and probably incorrectly is the title. I probably didn't even read it, but it was a nice idea. I really like this book, and I can kind of guess, I suppose, at the origins of it. But perhaps you could explain a little bit why you felt this book now, and I suppose in an interesting way, as an architect, as a practicing architect, how you get to the point of writing a book. Because architecture, I think, certainly to young trainee architects, students of architecture, it seems very all-encompassing, and the opportunity to write and to get this mental space and the time to write is difficult. So how do you get there? And yeah, what drove it?
Yeah, it's a really good point, actually. I mean, just that point about writing a book. Until I started writing, which is probably about 10 years ago, I suppose, I really thought I couldn't write. I thought that architecture, for a start, was a profession where people didn't really write, and that I was somebody who definitely didn't write. I didn't write very much when I was at school. I didn't do A levels that involved essay writing. I wrote very little at university. I did a lot of drawing, and I really enjoyed drawing and making an awful lot. And so I came to writing really late, and that was a real surprise. So the origins of the book go back to us, Zoe Smith, Cordula Weiser, and myself, setting up a practice in 2013. And we were three mums in the different roles that we play with young children. I'd had my third child at that time. And so my career, and I don't talk about this quite often, but my career was quite quiet for quite a long period of time. I was quite part-time, and my eldest daughter has a lot of health issues that needed quite a lot of looking after. So I really had to look to the family first. They were my kind of priority, and it meant that my career was it was quietly ticking along, and we were doing, the three of us were doing quite a lot of small projects, and we wanted to come together and do bigger stuff. And these things that kind of came together at the same time. And the story I usually tell is that I was inspired by the movement that's called Playing Out, because I heard about it on the radio. I heard a story about parents closing the street to cars and children being able to play outside. And it's something that I think, that freedom to be able to play and be a child, that I realised was being lost on my street, kind of typical terraced housing street, very desirable street that we'd been lucky enough to buy in before the houses got really expensive, but was just lined with cars. And that kind of experience that we'd had as children playing outside on streets with some cars had just disappeared. And so when I suggested to the local authority, Hackney, that we had a play street, they were like, yeah, you're not the first parent that's got in touch with us about this. We are going to do this, and we're going to support the growth of play streets in the borough. So we started a play street, and I could see that the movement was growing. In fact, there was an event at City Hall when Boris Johnson was still the mayor, and lots of the sort of volunteer sector, perhaps the third sector, were there talking about streets and talking about campaigning. And I stood there and I said, I think this is a planning issue. Is there anybody else thinking the same thing? And there was a lot of, I think at the time, people going, what do you mean? And I thought to myself, we need to start thinking about planning policy, because if children are playing out somewhere, and my hunch is that they probably are on housing estates in and around where I live, we need to find out what the spatial conditions are, and we need to design it in. That should be our job. This is obvious. It was such a kind of obvious thing. So I looked around, and the first thing I did was I asked, oh, it's hilarious. I asked Hackney, I said, do you have any statistics on where children play out? And they said, no, of course we don't. But actually, when you think about it, if you now think, well, you probably should do, because it's the biggest link you could have to kind of health and well-being, considering, what you're up against. But of course they didn't. So the idea then was that I had to go out and find out where they were playing. If there was to be some kind of understanding spatially, not just from a policy perspective in terms of intent, but like what are the spatial conditions, then I was going to have to find it out for myself. So I was still teaching at the time at University of East London, where I started working when my youngest was a year old. And the students and I set about looking at some housing estates in Hackney, and we worked it out from there. And the idea was that we should start mapping it and start saying, these are the spatial conditions. This is what helps children play out. There are some rules here. There's a system at play. And really what we were doing was we were trying to launch or move our practice away from small projects into bigger stuff, into housing, and to become experts in something that we had no experience in.
What's the statistics behind the playing out thing? I mean, obviously, I remember playing out on the street and getting involved in, antisocial behavior as often as possible. But do children not play out as much? I mean, it's one of these things that we say and we accept as being true because it's not like it was when I was a lad. But is it statistically true?
Yeah, there's been a huge decline in children playing outside. There's been a decline in them walking to school independently. Been something like a 50% decline. I'm afraid I don't have the statistics close to hand, but if playing out were here, they could reel them off to you. There's a huge decline in it. And, if you can link that decline to health, you can look at obesity levels, you can link it to screens. You can link it to all sorts of things. I think sometimes it's problematic to know what the kind of cause and effects are, but I think the most obvious one physically is that the streets when I was younger were almost without well, not entirely, but had far fewer cars on. I think the number of cars has doubled in the last generation or something.
Is that right?
Yeah. So we've got far more cars. They're bigger.
Mm.
They take up more space.
But they are softer. I mean, they have crumple zones. Like getting hit by a Ford Capri, I don't know, maybe this is libelous,
I don't
is
know.
going to be a very painful affair. Whereas you get hit by a Ford Cougar, and that's going to crumple like a larder. I don't know. I'm kind of interested in it. I wonder whether it's a chicken and egg. I was just watching a video about cycling in Holland and how they have the lowest cycle helmet wearing of any country, and the lowest deaths per kilometre cycled of any country in the world.
Yeah. I mean, is that because there's more cyclists? Is that because there's better cycle routes? Is that because they're not wearing helmets? I mean, lots of people think less helmets is a good thing because people behave more carefully.
And I wonder if that's with cars. Once you make cars extremely safe, I mean, they are driven crazy fast.
Yes,
I've noticed that.
they're much safer for the car driver. Is that
Yeah.
what you're? Yes, right. So when you talked about crumpling, that's to the benefit of the car driver.
Well, it's to the benefit of both. So I suppose you become risk averse in relation to yourself, but also in relation to, well, if I hit that car, or sorry, if I if I have an accident, they're not going to be so badly off. I'm not going to be so badly off.
That's definitely not the case. Like if you hit a child at 30 miles an hour, they're going to die. So you know.
I mean, I know it's not true, but maybe that's the kind of subconscious perception of it.
Yeah, I think well, if we're going to go down this route, and I don't know enough about it, but I do think what we have is an industry. I'm not going to libel anyone here, but I think the car industry is similar to the tobacco industry in that keeping cars on the road, electric as well, is of primary consideration for the industry and the oil industry at the moment.
And the government industry. I mean, the government doesn't want to dissuade people from paying fuel duty. I mean, for me, this is the trick that they worked out with smoking, is that they worked out that if you incrementally increase taxation on smoking, you reduce the number of people quitting smoking a lot, and you need them to keep smoking, really, because the tax is great.
I mean, we're going down an interesting route of discussion, aren't we? But I think
but I think it's very important, isn't it? Why have we cultivated over the last 25, 30 years a doubling of cars?
well, I'm putting it in a different in the context of perhaps as an architect, if I'm sitting in a meeting or in a public consultation with a scheme where our job is to think out about where the houses sit, where the cars sit, where the people move, where the children play, where all of that works in a plan. And we're usually being tasked with having to make an argument for each one of those things in a kind of hierarchical system. And my argument is we've got the hierarchy the wrong way round, because the most important person there in that space is actually the child, because some statistic like they spend 85% of their time not in education, their time awake, which is a great DFE statistic that suggests that therefore those of us who are designing the homes and the neighborhoods where these children are spending all their time really need to get that space right for them. But we are constantly in a position where we're arguing for the position of the car, the position of the child. And unfortunately, there's not enough political will behind us to say, it's okay, we've already made that decision. The child is the most important person here. We know that because it's the future of our planet, it's the future of our society, it's who we all are. The car is just a metal box. We don't prioritize the car over the child. That would be insane. But that's not the conversation that we're having. We're having a very different conversation, which comes down to aspiration, growth, jobs, and a lot of other things that somehow result in, well, I'm going to have to park my car outside the front of my house because that's what I want. And actually, you're absolutely right. I think an awful lot of what's the word? An awful lot of reasoning has gone into that. Is that the right word? There's a lot of politics and a lot of money behind why we end up at that point, and why the architect is left going, I want this to be a landscape-led, child-friendly scheme, but I'm really pushing a boulder up a hill here.
Yeah.
Why am I having to do this? Why am I having to have this conversation again?
I don't think it's conspiratorial to think
No.
that, as you have suggested, the car manufacturing lobby is perhaps more knowledgeable about the effects of its product and more entwined within planning than we would care to imagine. It
Yeah.
must be the case because it's only policy that makes it so. And policy can be changed. It's just words on paper. Like, it's not that complicated. So it must be that it's complicated somewhere else. I could talk about that for hours. I want to get to this idea of play. And when I saw your book, it was being promoted online in various places. And I thought it was fascinating. I'm a father, I'm a parent to children, and I do a lot of work around play myself. But I wanted to know what you meant by play to begin with. When you're talking about play, and when we talk about children not having opportunities to play in urban space, I think people imagine basketball courts, football pitches, skateboard parks. What do you mean?
Yeah, you ask a really good question because, first of all, I think what's interesting and important is that the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child provides children with the right to play. And that right within that age group of 0 to 18 is unique to them. And although people talk about playing at other ages, it's a really important part of development. And it doesn't really stop at 18, but at 18 you're able to vote, you're enfranchised, you have or should have a certain amount of agency. For children, it's that thing where they get to do what they want to do. So it's really varied. It can be sociable, it can be imaginative, it can be risk-taking in different ways, physically or in all of those ways. It can be about playing a game with other people, but usually it's not about sport. It's a slightly different kind of activity because it's got a definition as being intrinsically motivated, self-directed. So it's not about there being a goal or being a kind of a prize that you win at the end of it. But then it could still be a game of football as well, a kind of relaxed game of football. It's not really about exercise, but it might be about movement. It might include exercise. And in fact, when children play outside, they tend to exercise quite a lot. So there's some really good outcomes from it. And you're learning about the world and you're learning for a really extended period of time. As a species, we have this really extended childhood, as I read and heard recently, because we have to learn a lot of skills about how to cultivate and prepare food for our special big brains that we have. We don't just pick it up off the ground and eat it. That doesn't take an awful lot of learning, but we have a lot longer to learn more complex things. So we need a lot of time outside with our friends, learning from them, watching what they're doing. And so play, that's what play is. And that's why children are motivated to do it. They're completely naturally motivated to do it. But we take away the conditions and the permission for them to play again and again. I think what's interesting, if you did suggest that we could talk about screens within that, because actually we all, and particularly children, play on screens, and that could be, texting friends or having conversations, but it also could be gaming. So the world of play has in some ways expanded for children by having screens included in them. And actually, maybe to adults' kind of horror, when they see children in space and with their screens present, they can't quite believe it. And it's true that it can kind of, stunt our other social interactions, but quite often it's part of how older children particularly might be socializing and being outside. And so what they do with those screens and how they move forward is going to be different to what we did. But essentially, my argument is that if we don't have the space and the time and the permission, and I didn't invent those three words together, for children to play, then they will find alternative ways to play and they will go on screens. Because if you talk to them about whether they'd rather be playing outside with friends or on screens, they'll say they'd rather be playing outside with friends, certainly younger ones. So play is a lot of different things. You asked me if it's skipping or football. It needs to be all of those things, really. You need to be able to try it all out.
What are the effects of play on city space? And I suppose, and your book does go back to this, looking at some of the historical environments that were built, particularly post-war, modern environments that have been built that were constructive of play or facilitated play or encouraged play. What were the known effects, or what were the, I guess, reported effects of this? How did it change things?
I think that what I found quite interesting in reading for the book was really looking back at the kind of post-war, particularly the post-war housing boom, because if you have a period of time where you can really look at a kind of deliberate attempt to house the population and to think about different ways that we could do that. Obviously, we as architects look quite a lot at the housing, and we sometimes think about the way it's situated. And there's a whole mixture, isn't there, of different typologies that we might come across. We might be looking at the slab blocks or the tower blocks. I mean, some of them weren't actually designed by architects. I'm sure we all know that. Some of them were just builders, I should say. They were builders. But actually, at the same time, there was quite a radical landscape architecture approach. And this isn't something that I knew an awful lot about until I started reading for the book. And in fact, some of that, it goes back really to a sense of everybody had to think about how to heal a generation of people after the traumas of war. And children were a way of looking forward and not thinking about what people had just experienced. And in childhood lay this kind of paradox of hopefulness, but also the kind of threat of how children can subvert things. You started off by talking about being antisocial. You described yourself as being antisocial. That, there's the constant threat of children being antisocial. That's never, ever not been there. And I think the adventure playground movement was a way to kind of allow children to really explore those edges of their childhood that I think people at the time realized that was going to be a good idea, and there was a lot of space. There was far less people living in cities. There were all these bomb sites, and there's this fantastic idea that you could repurpose these dangerous bits of spaces and children could play in them. And then from that these kind of playable landscapes, the loose parts theory, where it was about giving children the chance to play with tools and materials and just let them see what they did with them. It was woven into the theories of landscape at the time that were part of the Parker Morris standards, and I hadn't realized how powerful those were and important, and actually how many women were involved. I think it's a sort of slightly unknown or forgotten about piece of our recent history. And so when we were trying, building the new towns and thinking about the inner city areas that were being really de-densified, they were laying out buildings in green space, and play was part of that. And there were some playgrounds, there were some play areas, and there was just lots of space. And I don't know whether people thought hugely about, how children would get between those spaces, but there was a degree of thinking about it. And I think, unfortunately, what's happened is we've been left with this quite simplified version after Alice Coleman's looked at it and after we've looked at it through a space syntax lens. And it's what I say in the book is, hold on a minute, we're not thinking about it from the child's perspective. A lot of children will have grown up and used those spaces and played in those spaces. And actually, when you start talking to people, it turns out that that's the case. And so all of the kind of rhetoric around sink estates and all the kind of opportunity to then refurbish and regenerate and bulldoze them comes about because we decide that they just don't work, but actually they were intended to work and did work in a lot of ways, spatially, some better than others. And that's what I got very interested in. What were the ones that worked and what were the ones that didn't work?
A methodological question then I want to ask, which is, how do you see and how do you measure these things? How do you document the efficacy of play? Because I think that is pertinent to what you're saying, this idea of the sinker state. I remember at university when I was an incredibly arrogant 19-year-old. Can you imagine? And Greg Keefe, who's now, I think, professor at Queen's in Belfast, he was talking about some housing estates in Hume, and I described them as guinea pig hutches or something like that. And he pulled me up and he said they're people's homes. And it was a good point, and it was a fair point, and it was embarrassing. And it was, I suppose, pertained to this idea, which is that it's very easy to just see the problem and not understand the solution. So you talk about sinker states, it's very easy to not then notice that there's loads of kids playing around the place. There's loads of children actually not slinging drugs and stabbing each other, but actually living childhoods. How did you, in this book, go about documenting this? What was your method for identifying it? And how did you, again, to get onto the point that I want to follow on, how did you then correlate this with the spatialities of home and home life?
So what we did was, starting back with those students at University of East London, we got them to stand in housing estates for hours at a time and count how many people were in that space. And we got them to count what ages they were, they had to guess, and how long they were there and what they were doing in the space. And so from that, we could get a kind of graph, if you like, of children playing outside independently, which was interesting, and age groups and time spent outside. So we started to build up data, and then from that series of research projects where we did it again and again and again over different housing estates with properly paid researchers, and we started to work out what we thought might be the kind of commonalities between the spaces where we saw the most play. And some things came up pretty quickly. First of all, where we saw children playing outside independently, we saw more other age groups as well, adults, not always so much teenagers, but there were always more adults outside too. And so we thought, well, hang on, they're not adults that are supervising play, they're adults that are outside enjoying that space as well. So maybe there's something about that space that just works from a human perspective. That was an interesting observation. And another thing we started to find out was that there were certain characteristics that really supported the play, and that actually some of the characteristics that people thought were going to work weren't working. So, for example, the easiest one is if you can just go straight out of your home and into a space, and there's other homes that are able to do that as well, what we call being directly accessible. That's a really good element that supports play. That's a really good sort of layout element. If you overlooking is important, but there's types of overlooking. So overlooking just by a window isn't quite the same as overlooking by balconies and deck access where people are moving around on that facade. But also if that space is connected to another space, and that's partly to do with whether it's on a route home. So the more people are moving through that space naturally, I always think is very important. Not just about overlooking. Overlooking can sometimes work against you if there's just too many homes around a space. And of course, the presence of the car. And actually, you might think that it has to be completely car-free, and obviously that's ideal, but children play out an awful lot on cul-de-sacs where cars aren't moving through, and children are worried about, breaking car windows. That's the kind of opposite of being worried about being injured or killed by them, which is a real concern. But interestingly, because those other spatial elements are in play, the directly accessible, connected to another space and overlooked, the fact that cars are present in that space, and we would find again and again car parks, cul-de-sacs, children played out in them. So we realised that it was a combination of these factors and that we could put them together in slightly different ways, and that the best places, the places where the children told us that they played, where we saw them playing, because we started to also interview children, were the ones where those spatial elements were in place. And it ever since figuring that out, we've just repeated it again and again and again and again. And we've kind of cross-referenced that with what people tell us. This is a space where the community hangs out. This is a space where everybody comes out in the summer. Oh, look, it's got those 4 elements in place. It's the same every single time. And so it starts to become a kind of system that we use to apply to analysing space. And it throws up all sorts of really interesting considerations, like where might you put that infill block? Why is it that space, doesn't matter how much nice equipment we put in it or how much lighting we put in it just doesn't work? Why is it attracting
as both?
Yeah, criminal activity, drug dealing. So it gets to the point now where I say, you don't want to design in the drug dealing, do you? And so you need to make sure these things are working, because if you don't, you'll be designing a really good space for drug dealing.
Interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of that kind of post-war housing did lead to those kind of unsighted areas which in marginalized communities led to severe criminality and antisocial behavior and just overriding threat, which is something you mentioned, Alice Coleman, something obviously she was very interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of those housing estates, or in fact probably all of them, because they're quite varied, have some spaces like that, but then they'll have some spaces that are more successful. And when you have conversations with people who live there, they'll tell you how and why it works. And what's really interesting is that you can use those elements in conversation with them because they're really obvious. They're just really basic, straightforward, recognizable things when you're standing in a space.
Yeah.
But there, I mean, also other things happen in where people live. Age ranges shift and change, and families might be really challenged. People are human and dynamic and different. So I'm not saying that it's entirely spatial, but the point is that you really need to get the spatial layout right for the right conditions.
Yeah.
To support people to kind of lead happy, healthy lives.
And is there a kind of proportional thing? Is there a kind of ratio? Again, I want to come to this idea of the home and why your book is so focused on the home. And some of the case studies that you use in the book the case studies are our homes as well. This is not just about generalized playability of the urban space. This is this very distinct type of play. So it's very much related to kind of family life.
Yeah, it's very much focused on children. And when you read through the book, there is a deliberate kind of narrative arc, if you like, where towards the end I start to ask somebody who hasn't got children, who's older, what she thinks about the estate she lives in. And she questions the play street in front of her house that she loves, but says it's not a play street, it's a social street. So she starts to see the behaviors and the activities as not primarily being about play, which is really interesting. And she starts to see where or articulate where the challenges are, where the courtyards are really tight.
Yeah.
And lots of things are happening at the same time and how difficult that is. And we also talked about, how difficult estate regeneration is, because she's somebody who has worked in planning all her life. So she understands it from all perspectives and is a resident. So I think it does start with children. And of course, if you don't have children or your children have left home, you might find the sight and sound and detritus of children playing irritating. You might love it all, or there might be bits of it you don't like. So I'm not saying that there's that it's not without its challenges. And I'm not saying that somebody kicking a ball against your garden wall isn't irritating. But there's something interesting when you talk to people about their own childhoods, not about children, but about their own childhoods, where they recognize that was an important part of their life, and that being a bit naughty maybe and being able to play out freely and do the things they did was important, and that they wouldn't take that away from children today if they had to.
No. Have you found that there is, I suppose, cultural differences in the appetite for having children play out of the house? Your book is kind of focused on the UK context, but did you, I guess, quote unquote, learn from the South?
No, I thought about that. I thought about going to the global South, and because I wanted to look at the perimeter block as a kind of typology, I didn't think I could find so much of that in big cities in the global South, and I could kind of track that sort of type of development. But I think what is really interesting about play is that, of course, it's universal. Because going back to that point of it being for us as a species important, doesn't matter where you go in the world. So I say that last year I went to Chicago to do some work with the Van Leer Foundation, who are focused very much on families of very young children. And I stood in a courtyard where it was very similar to the kind of conditions that we talk about, are all in place. And there was some interesting dynamics going on between the mums, actually, they all were in that courtyard, but the play was really, really happening. The thing that was different was that they have the real threat of gun crime. And so for them, gating their estate was fundamentally important. And you could see that for their children's safety, that is something that you couldn't argue against. And I think there are other factors in other parts of the world that you can't just impose. You talked a moment ago about Northern Ireland randomly, I guess, but when you go and talk to people in Belfast, there are some other issues that come into play to do with communities and peace lines and the way people use space there. So yes, to a certain extent, there are some sort of bigger cultural forces at play. But on the other hand, play is universal. It's something that happens in refugee camps, or should do, and everywhere. But it's under threat by other things, if you like.
Yeah. Neoliberal urban development policy, mainly.
Yeah.
I think, to put a name to it. But you mentioned gun crime, which is, I'm going to hopelessly segue into thinking about risky play. Is there evidence that certain forms of risk are necessary to make a fruitful play environment? So not just one of those bloody awful playgrounds where they've got those little kind of ducks on a massive spring that kind of rock them back and forward about 6 inches, and swings that have not chains but metal poles they do now, so that people can't whiz them around the top, so teenagers can't whiz them around the top. But and I ask this because it's kind of like, obviously you've got that idea of physical risk that comes in with certain forms of play, the brutalist playground kind of model. But there's this other side to this riskiness, which you've picked on as well, which I'm kind of fascinated by, which is there a risk, I suppose, in thinking about the joy of play in the city? It's a bit of a middle class thing. Like, streets are dangerous in poor places. There's county lines gangs who are picking up 10-year-old, 9-year-old kids. There's grooming gangs. There's a lot of stuff. Like, maybe street play isn't great for certain communities. Maybe we need to design out and just make the houses proportionally a bit bigger and give them better Wi-Fi. It's a sort of updated Robert Venturi, children don't need to play in the street, they should be at home playing PlayStation.
Yeah, give them what they want.
Yeah, give them dopamine.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of like that argument because it's better than the answer can't be the springy chicken, which is what we call that thing that you just described.
Thank you.
Because it's saying, why don't we give them what they want? Why don't we give the children what they want? Why are we in this funny, and some of my peers will be kind of rolling their eyes that I say this, but why are we in this funny no man's land between off the screens, but like also don't go outside, but also, like the number of rules in place are so confusing. And there's an awful lot of parental blaming as well, that there's no space in between. And I think, I pick up a lot on when people talk about these things in the media, and they talk about there's no time for boredom, and all of these sort of really awful negative things. You think, what kind of childhood do you want them to have? They're supposed to be kind of like bored, not on screens. Also, they can't really play outside. They should be well behaved, but they should also be doing lots of risky play at some point. Like you say, on the face of it, parents who are living in challenging situations, who might not have the time and the space to support their children, and have high aspirations for them to be doing well in life, may think that play is something that is a nice to have. And I think, unfortunately, if we don't think about it in the round and think, actually, what happens when you allow communities to kind of work together to sort of live around a space, look after that space, and see that space as the place where the community heart lives. The children play outside, the parents get to know each other, support each other, those who really need lots of support, people who are older, start to talk and meet each other there. That's those spaces are so vital for communities, and they always were back in ever, for as long as time. But the biggest problem we've got is we've either overloaded them with people, or we've overloaded them with people and cars. And so that really, really important space often, and here's where I think this is quite political, is not part of the discourse when we talk about the 15-minute city. It's not part of the discourse when we talk about why traditional architecture is better than modernism, which, to be honest, from my perspective, I don't care in this particular argument. I do think that the relationship between, going back to your question, the inside of the home, the way we function, and that outside space is really important for architects to consider how the inside and outside spaces relate to each other, and how you manage to do that in quite tight situations where you're having to, meet your cost plan. And is subtly different, say, between the UK and the Netherlands, where their ground floor layouts are not quite the same as ours, which is interesting. And similarly in Denmark. I think that's quite interesting. And I do think so. I don't think it's just about landscape and urbanism. It is about architecture. It is about the layout of the home. So going back to my point, that space where we all gather round and the buildings gather around it somehow has lost its importance. And you can read about it in the National Model Design Codes, and it's quite often got a road around it. And I think, well, it's not going to work.
No.
And we need to recognise that.
Yeah. It's an interesting point you make about Venice as well, which is a traditional city, and families don't live there because you can't get around it. I think there's like 2 bridges that aren't stepped. I mean, it's like a nightmare if you've got a pram, or if you're disabled, or if you're really pregnant. But it does look pretty. How does your book teach us as architects? What moves does it teach us as architects to adopt, to consider? And not just design moves, but actually as an observer and as a researcher. Like, is there a sort of rule of thumb here in terms of working as a designer? And I suppose also in terms of the architect's role in leveraging policy, leveraging the planning process, development processes. Is there anything we can do?
Yeah, there's an awful lot we can do. Our hands are quite tied with the system. What the book touches on is that the volume house builders have got the system tied up. And in fact, they're building inefficient, unsustainable development, and that we could be providing more homes on these sites in ways that were more supportive to the communities that were living there. And we need to challenge that, and we need to show the evidence again and again, or we will be kept with these car-centric developments. And there's a huge, huge amount of opportunity there, but the system isn't shifting. There's opportunity for us to use it to support kind of what I say good looks like. So we work with a lot of architects. We do lots of collaborative work. And many of the architects we work with kind of need this. They kind of need to come armed with this book and say, it's written in here. This is what we're doing. It's not ZCD Architects' design approach. It's an approach that underpins good practice in architecture and housing design. So I think what's been kind of heartwarming about writing this book is that people are really excited about it because it's helping them do more of what they want to do. So, and hopefully it's written in such a way as, I mean, my dad read it and he said, it's really easy to understand. And he's not an architect. And he said, I like the way you just built up the argument. He'd say this because he's my dad, obviously, until there was no other way of looking at it. And I thought, well, that's good, because I want it to be accessible. I want students to be able to read it. I want policymakers to be able to read it. And I want architects to be able to read it. And I want them to be able to think that they can talk more clearly to their communities about what matters. So it's got to cross over.
Yeah. What are the best examples that you've seen of this outside, perhaps including your own work, that have adopted a kind of play-based approach to this sort of work? That's a very broad question, because obviously we have volume house building, we have high-rise houses, we have new deck access houses, we have so on and so forth.
I mean, I think there's 10 case studies in the book, and I think they're all really good examples. I think some of them, all of them throw up kind of challenges that we have to be aware of. There's co-housing blocks in there, and you know, that co-housing is not going to take over the world, if that was ever a statement anyone was ever going to make. I
wish it would. I would love intentional community.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't think anybody would love intentional community with me, but I would love to do it with them. I would love to do it at them.
Yeah, I think we'd all like the idea of living, well, lots of us would like the idea of living like that. And then the very, very dense blocks. There's a really nice example in Barking Riverside where I think they really thought hard. Sorry, not Barking Riverside, in Gascoigne Estate in Barking. Barking Riverside is another estate I looked at previously, which is also really good. But in Gascoigne Estate, where they thought really hard about how to connect those spaces together. It's not entirely successful, which they would agree with, I think, because of some of the kind of ways in which the highways kind of won, perhaps, and
and this is by whom?
This is by White Architecture for Be First in Barking and Dagenham. That's in the chapter 5. There is, I like the Port Loop development in Birmingham, where Urban Splash with Howes just said, right, well, we're going to make the gardens a communal space. I mean, that's really easy. Sometimes I think to myself, everyone's going to turn around and go, it's not that hard, is it, what you're talking about? You can leave us alone now and we can get on with it. We don't need any books.
No, it's possibly not, but for some weird reason, we seem to need regular reminders. Anyway, that's a wonderful point to finish on. Dinah, thank you so very much for speaking with me.
Thank you.
Tagore puts it like this: child, how happy you are sitting in the dust, playing with a broken twig all the morning. And later on, in my frail canoe I struggle to cross the sea of desire and forget that I too am playing a game. Thank you to Dinah for taking the time to speak with me. It was genuinely lovely. And to RIBA for the PDF of the book. Please see the podcast descriptions for links to it and to Dinah's professional and social profiles. And thanks for listening.